The downtown Seattle coffee shop had always been a sanctuary. Soft jazz played through hidden speakers, the smell of fresh ground beans filled the air, and the large windows looked out onto the rain-slicked streets. It was the kind of place where people came to escape, to find a moment of peace in a chaotic world. But today, that peace was shattered. 3 men had walked in 20 minutes ago, and the entire atmosphere had changed. They weren't just loud, they were deliberately intimidating. The leader, a muscular man in his early 30s with a shaved head and a spider web tattoo crawling up his neck, had immediately started causing problems. His name was Derek, and he moved through the world like he owned it. His 2 friends were cut from the same cloth. One was tall and wiry with mean eyes. The other was stocky and covered in prison tattoos. Together, they were a toxic combination of arrogance, aggression, and entitlement. They'd already made the young barista cry when she'd asked them to lower their voices. They'd knocked over a display of coffee mugs, laughed about it, and refused to clean it up. They'd made crude comments to every woman in the shop. The other customers kept their heads down, pretending not to notice, praying the storm would pass them by. But storms don't just pass. They find a target. Before we continue with this incredible story, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us share these powerful stories of courage and sacrifice. Hit that like button and turn on notifications so you never miss a hero's story. In the far corner of the coffee shop, sitting at a small table with a half-finished latte and an open book, was a woman who seemed completely out of place among the fear and tension. Her name was Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen, though no one in this coffee shop knew that. To them, she was just another customer. A disabled woman in a wheelchair. Someone to be pitied. Or worse, ignored. Sarah was in her early 40s, though her face held the kind of timeless beauty that transcended age. She was Asian American with striking features, high cheekbones, intelligent dark eyes that missed nothing, and short black hair with subtle silver streaks that she'd earned through 2 decades of military service. She wore a simple black leather jacket over a gray Henley shirt and dark jeans. Her arms, visible below her rolled-up sleeves, were lean and muscular, marked with the kind of definition that came from years of intense physical training. Her wheelchair was sleek and modern, clearly custom-built. And attached to the frame, positioned where anyone who knew what to look for could see it, was a small metal insignia. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't large. But to those who understood, it was everything. It was the insignia of the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta. Delta Force. The most elite counterterrorism unit in the United States military. Sarah had been a Delta Force operator for 15 years before the mission that changed everything. She'd been on more classified operations than most people would ever know existed. She'd rescued hostages from terrorist compounds in Syria. She'd hunted high-value targets through the mountains of Afghanistan. She'd operated in the shadows in places that didn't officially exist on any map. She'd given everything to her country. And on a dusty road outside of Baghdad 3 years ago, she'd given even more. But the 3 men who were now approaching her table didn't know any of that. They didn't see a decorated war hero. They didn't see one of the most lethal operators in American military history. They saw what they wanted to see, a vulnerable target. A woman alone. A woman in a wheelchair. They saw weakness. They had no idea how wrong they were. Derek approached first, his boots heavy on the hardwood floor. His friends flanked him, forming a wall of intimidation. The other customers looked away, unwilling to get involved. The barista behind the counter froze, her hand hovering over the phone, not sure if she should call the police. Well, Derek said, his voice dripping with false charm. What do we have here? A pretty little thing all by herself. Sarah didn't look up from her book. She turned the page calmly, took a sip of her latte, and continued reading as if he didn't exist. The deliberate dismissal hit Derek like a slap. His smile disappeared, replaced by something darker. Something dangerous. Hey, he snapped, louder now. I'm talking to you. Sarah slowly raised her eyes from her book. She looked at Derek with the kind of calm, measured gaze that made him instinctively take half a step back before he even realized he was doing it. There was something in those eyes. Something that whispered of danger. Of violence held carefully in check. I heard you, Sarah said, her voice quiet but perfectly clear. I chose not to respond. Derek's face flushed red. His friends chuckled nervously, uncertain. The tall wiry one spoke up, trying to back his friend. You got a problem with us, lady? No, Sarah replied, returning her attention to her book. I don't have a problem with you. But if you continue this conversation, you're going to have a problem with me. The threat was delivered so calmly, so matter-of-factly, that for a moment Derek almost believed it. Almost. But then he looked down at her wheelchair, at her seated position, at what he perceived as her helplessness, and his anger returned tenfold. Oh really? He sneered, reaching down and snatching the book from her hands. And what exactly is a crippled girl gonna do about it? Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Her hands, which had been holding her book, now rested on the arms of her wheelchair. Calm. Patient. Waiting. Last chance, she said, her voice dropping even lower. Give me back my book, apologize for your behavior, and walk away. This is the only warning you're going to get. Derek laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. He held her book high above his head, taunting her. Come and get it, sweetheart. Oh wait, you can't. His friends laughed. The stocky one with the prison tattoos leaned down and flicked the Delta Force insignia on her wheelchair. What's this supposed to be? You buy this at a military surplus store. Trying to look tough. Sarah's eyes locked onto the hand that had touched her insignia. When she spoke, her voice was ice. That insignia represents the 15 years I spent hunting men like you in places you can't even pronounce. It represents the 63 confirmed enemy combatants I personally eliminated to keep this country safe. It represents the blood, sweat, and sacrifice of the most elite warriors this nation has ever produced. She paused, letting her words sink in. And you just disrespected it. Derek's smile faltered for just a second. There was something in her tone, in the absolute certainty of her words, that sent a chill down his spine. But his pride wouldn't let him back down. Not in front of his friends. Not in front of this crowd of scared civilians. You're full of it, he spat. Delta Force doesn't take women. And they definitely don't take cripples. They took me, Sarah said simply. And I was one of the best they ever had. The stocky friend snorted. Okay, sure. So what happened? You get hurt doing paperwork? Trip over your desk? Sarah's eyes grew distant for just a moment, seeing something that wasn't in this coffee shop. Seeing a desert road. A convoy. An IED that had been hidden beneath the sand. I was leading a convoy outside Baghdad, she said, her voice steady despite the memories. We were transporting a high-value intelligence asset. My vehicle hit an IED. The blast threw us off the road. While my driver was unconscious and my gunner was wounded, enemy combatants opened fire from 3 directions. I returned fire, eliminated 4 hostiles, called in air support, and maintained defensive position for 17 minutes until quick reaction force arrived. She looked directly at Derek. The explosion that threw our vehicle also caused severe spinal trauma. The doctors said I'd never walk again. They were right. But what they didn't say is that I'd still be more dangerous in this chair than most people will ever be on their feet. The coffee shop had gone completely silent. Every customer was now openly watching. The barista had her phone out, recording. But Derek, his pride wounded and his authority challenged, couldn't let it go. Prove it, he sneered. I don't need to prove anything to you, Sarah replied. You're not worth my time. That was the final straw. Derek's face twisted with rage. He grabbed the edge of her wheelchair and, before anyone could react, he shoved it hard to the side. The chair tilted dangerously, and Sarah had to grip the arms to keep from falling. Her latte spilled across the table, the hot liquid splashing onto her lap and the floor. The entire coffee shop gasped. The barista screamed. One elderly customer started to stand up, but his wife pulled him back down, terrified. Sarah looked down at the spilled coffee soaking into her jeans. She looked at her wheelchair, now several feet from the table where it had been violently pushed. Then she looked up at Derek, and her expression was absolutely terrifying in its calmness. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," she said quietly. Derek laughed, but it sounded forced now. "Nervous? Yeah. What are you gonna do about it? You gonna call the cops? You gonna?" He never finished his sentence. Because at that exact moment, sitting at a booth near the window, a man in his late 20s with a military haircut and a faded Army Ranger tattoo on his forearm had seen enough. His name was Marcus, and he was home on leave after a deployment in Africa. He'd been watching the entire confrontation unfold, his anger building with every passing second. He'd noticed Sarah's insignia the moment he'd walked into the coffee shop that morning. He'd given her the subtle nod that one warrior gives to another, a silent acknowledgement of shared experience. And now he'd just watched 3 civilian thugs assault a Delta Force operator. That could not stand. Marcus pulled out his phone and dialed a number he'd been given during a joint training exercise 6 months ago. It was answered on the first ring. "Colonel Briggs," came the gruff voice on the other end. "Sir, this is Sergeant Marcus Webb, 75th Ranger Regiment. I'm sorry to call you directly, but I have a situation. I'm at the Emerald City Coffee House on Pike Street. There's a woman here, a Delta operator from the looks of her insignia. 3 civilians just assaulted her. Sir, they pushed her wheelchair. They're mocking her service." There was a long, dangerous pause on the other end of the line. "Did you say Delta?" Colonel Briggs asked, his voice suddenly razor-sharp. "Yes, sir. Female operator, Asian American, early 40s, wheelchair-bound. The insignia looks authentic." Another pause. Then, "Give me a description." Marcus provided the details. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Son," Colonel Briggs said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury, "you're looking at Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen. She's a legend. She's saved more lives than you can count. And someone just put their hands on her." "Yes, sir." "You sit tight, Sergeant. Help is on the way. And Sergeant? Make sure those 3 don't leave that coffee shop." "Yes, sir." "Hua." Marcus hung up the phone. He stood from his booth, walked calmly to the front door of the coffee shop, and positioned himself in front of it. His arms crossed over his chest. His face carved from stone. Derek and his friends were too busy taunting Sarah to notice. "You really thought you were tough, didn't you?" Derek was saying, his confidence returning now that he'd established physical dominance. "You thought that little medal was gonna scare us? Lady, I don't care if you were in the Girl Scouts." "You should," Sarah interrupted, her voice cutting through his rant like a blade. "Because in about 5 minutes, you're going to understand exactly what that insignia means. And by then, it will be far too late for apologies." Derek opened his mouth to respond, but the words died in his throat. Because outside the large windows of the coffee shop, 3 matte black SUVs with government plates had just pulled up to the curb in perfect formation. The entire coffee shop turned to look. Even Derek and his friends stopped their taunting and stared. The doors of the SUVs opened simultaneously, and 12 men stepped out onto the sidewalk. They weren't in uniform, but they didn't need to be. Everything about them screamed military. They moved with the fluid coordination of a unit that had trained together for years. They wore civilian clothes, jeans, boots, tactical jackets, but their builds were anything but civilian. These were warriors. Elite warriors. They were Delta Force operators, the same unit Sarah had served with. The same brothers and sisters she had bled beside. The same team she had saved. The lead man was Colonel James Reaper Briggs himself, a 6'4" wall of muscle with a shaved head, a thick beard, and eyes that had seen things most people couldn't imagine. He'd been Sarah's commanding officer for 10 years. He'd been in the convoy that day in Baghdad. He'd been one of the men she'd saved. The 12 operators formed up on the sidewalk, a perfect tactical formation, and began walking toward the coffee shop entrance. Their movements were synchronized. Their faces were hard. They looked like they were walking into a hostage rescue situation. Because in a way, they were. Inside the coffee shop, Derek's face had gone pale. His friends looked like they were about to be sick. They recognized danger when they saw it, and these men were danger personified. The door opened. Marcus stepped aside with a respectful nod as the 12 Delta Force operators filed into the coffee shop. They moved in complete silence, their boots barely making a sound on the hardwood floor. They spread out, tactically positioning themselves to control the entire room. 4 of them took positions near the exits. 4 more created a perimeter. The final 4, led by Colonel Briggs, walked directly toward Sarah's table. The entire coffee shop held its breath. Colonel Briggs's eyes found Sarah first. He saw the spilled coffee. He saw her wheelchair pushed away from the table. He saw the barely concealed rage in her eyes. Then he looked at Derek and his 2 friends, and his expression turned to stone. "Someone," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute authority, "want to tell me what happened here?" No one spoke. Derek looked like he was going to pass out. Colonel Briggs tried again. "Let me rephrase. Someone is going to tell me what happened here. Right now." One of the other customers, an older woman who'd been sitting nearby, spoke up. Her voice shook, but she was determined. "Those 3 men have been harassing everyone in here. They made fun of that woman's wheelchair. They called her names. And then that one pushed her. He pushed her wheelchair hard. She almost fell. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. Every one of the 12 operators turned their attention to Derek and his friends. It was like being stared at by a pack of wolves. Colonel Briggs walked slowly, deliberately, toward Derek. He didn't stop until he was inches away, towering over the thug. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but every word was carved from ice. "Do you know who that woman is?" Derek shook his head, unable to speak. "That," Colonel Briggs said, pointing at Sarah without taking his eyes off Derek, "is Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen. 15 years with the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta. 347 combat missions. 63 confirmed enemy kills. 2 silver stars. 3 bronze stars. 4 purple hearts. And the single most courageous act I have ever witnessed in my entire military career." He paused, letting his words sink in. 3 years ago, we were transporting a high-value asset outside Baghdad. Our convoy was ambushed. Lieutenant Colonel Chen's vehicle hit an IED. The blast was massive. It threw their Humvee into a ditch, killed the driver instantly, and severely wounded the gunner. Chen herself suffered catastrophic spinal injuries. One of the other operators, a Hispanic man with kind eyes and a scarred face, stepped forward. His voice was thick with emotion. "I was in the vehicle behind them. When I got to their Humvee, Lieutenant Colonel Chen was still returning fire despite her injuries. She couldn't feel her legs, but she held off the enemy combatants until air support arrived. She saved that asset. She saved her wounded gunner. And she saved our entire convoy." A third operator, an African-American man built like a tank, added his voice. "The doctors said she had 3 crushed vertebrae. They said she'd be paralyzed from the waist down. They said she'd never serve again. But Chen, She completed physical therapy in record time. She redesigned her own training program. She became the first wheelchair-bound operator to pass the Delta Force recertification course. She didn't just adapt, Colonel Briggs continued. She excelled. She continued to operate for 2 more years in a classified capacity, running intelligence operations and training new recruits. She gave everything to this country. Everything. And you. He leaned in even closer to Derek, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. You put your hands on her. Derek was trembling now. His earlier bravado had completely evaporated. I didn't know. I'm sorry. You're sorry. Colonel Briggs cut him off. You're sorry. Let me tell you what sorry is. Sorry is when a mother gets a folded flag because her son didn't come home. Sorry is when a wife gets a phone call at 3 in the morning. Sorry is when a Delta operator loses her ability to walk because she chose to save her team instead of saving herself. He straightened up, his voice now loud enough for the entire coffee shop to hear. That insignia you disrespected? That Delta Force insignia? There are fewer than 300 people on this entire planet who have earned the right to wear it. It represents sacrifice. It represents excellence. It represents a willingness to go into the darkest places on Earth, to face the worst humanity has to offer, so that people like you can live your soft, comfortable lives without ever knowing the horrors that exist just beyond your safe little bubble. He turned to address everyone in the coffee shop. This woman is a hero. A genuine American hero. She has saved more lives than you could count. She has prevented terrorist attacks. She has rescued hostages. She has hunted down and eliminated high-value targets that threatened our national security. And she paid a price that most of us can't even imagine. Colonel Briggs turned back to Derek. So yes, I'd say you're sorry. You're the sorriest excuse for a man I've ever seen. The stocky friend with the prison tattoos tried to speak. Look, man, we just... Shut up. The words came from another operator, a woman with blonde hair pulled back in a tight ponytail. She was lean and dangerous looking, with cold blue eyes. You don't speak unless you're spoken to. You don't move unless you're told to move. You stand there, and you listen. Derek finally found his voice. It came out as a pathetic whisper. What? What do you want us to do? Colonel Briggs looked at Sarah. Ma'am. They're your call. All eyes in the coffee shop turned to Sarah. She sat in her wheelchair, her posture perfect, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, she said nothing. She simply looked at the 3 men who had mocked her, who had pushed her, who had tried to make her feel small. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a quiet authority that made everyone stand a little straighter. I want you to understand something, she said, looking directly at Derek. You looked at my wheelchair and you saw weakness. You saw someone you could push around. Someone you could intimidate. Someone less than you. She gestured to her legs. But these? This chair? They're not signs of weakness. They're proof that when it mattered most, I chose my team over myself. I chose to complete the mission over my own safety. I chose to serve my country even when it cost me everything. Her voice grew stronger. You 3 walk around acting tough, intimidating people who can't fight back, picking on baristas and old ladies and women in wheelchairs. But you're not tough. You're cowards. Real strength isn't about who you can push around. It's about who you're willing to stand up for. It's about what you're willing to sacrifice for something bigger than yourself. She looked around at the 12 Delta Force operators surrounding her. These men and women. They're strong. They've earned their toughness through blood and sacrifice. They've proven themselves in ways you never could. And they came here today because we're a family. Because in this community, we protect our own. Sarah turned her attention back to Derek. So here's what you're going to do. First, you're going to apologize. Not to me, I don't need your apology. You're going to apologize to everyone in this coffee shop whose day you ruined. To the barista you made cry. To all the people you terrorized. Then, you're going to pay for everyone's drinks and food. All of it. Consider it an asshole tax. And finally, you're going to walk out of here, and you're never going to pull something like this again. Because the next time you decide to bully someone, you're going to remember this moment. You're going to remember that you never know who you're dealing with. You never know what battles they've fought. You never know what they've sacrificed. She leaned forward slightly in her wheelchair. And you're going to remember that actions have consequences. You got lucky today. These operators showed restraint. But luck runs out eventually. So take this as the lesson it is, and become better men. The silence that followed was absolute. Derek, his face flushed with shame, nodded. He turned to face the coffee shop. His voice shook as he spoke. I'm sorry, he said to the room at large. I'm sorry to everyone here. I'm sorry to the staff. I was way out of line. I was wrong. About everything. His friends mumbled similar apologies. They pulled out their wallets and handed all their cash to the barista, who was still crying but now for different reasons. The total came to over $600. Not enough, Colonel Briggs said flatly. Credit cards. Everything you've got. Everyone's meal, everyone's drink, plus $1,000 tip to the staff. Right now. They complied, hands shaking as they processed the payments. When it was done, Colonel Briggs nodded to the operators positioned by the doors. They stepped aside. Get out, he said simply. Derek and his friends didn't need to be told twice. They practically ran from the coffee shop, stumbling over each other in their haste to escape. Through the windows, the customers watched as they got into a beat-up car and sped away, tires squealing. The moment they were gone, the atmosphere in the coffee shop changed completely. The tension evaporated, replaced by something warm and powerful. The customers erupted in applause. The barista was sobbing with relief and gratitude. The elderly customer who'd wanted to help earlier walked over to Sarah and shook her hand, tears in his eyes. Thank you, he said simply. Thank you for your service. Others joined in, forming a line to express their gratitude. Sarah accepted each thanks with grace, though it clearly made her uncomfortable to be the center of attention. Colonel Briggs crouched down beside her wheelchair, his hard expression softening. You okay, Sarah? She nodded. I'm fine, Reaper. I had it under control. I know you did, he said with a slight smile. But we're still gonna show up. Every single time. The other operators gathered around, pulling chairs from other tables, forming a protective circle around their former commander. They weren't in a coffee shop anymore, they were in a team room. They were home. One of the operators, the woman with the blonde ponytail, laughed. Only you could cause an international incident in a Seattle coffee shop, Chen. Sarah smiled, a real, genuine smile. I just wanted a decent latte. Is that too much to ask? Apparently, another operator joked. The group laughed, the sound warm and full of genuine affection. Marcus, the Army Ranger who'd made the call, approached hesitantly. He stood at attention. Ma'am, Sergeant Marcus Webb, 75th Ranger Regiment. I apologize if I overstepped by calling Colonel Briggs, but... Sarah cut him off. You did exactly the right thing, Sergeant. Thank you. Colonel Briggs stood and extended his hand to Marcus. Good call, Ranger. You've got good instincts. If you ever want to try out for Delta, give me a call. He handed Marcus a card. Marcus took it with shaking hands, clearly overwhelmed. Thank you, sir. Hua. The coffee shop owner approached the group, still wiping tears from her eyes. Everything is on the house, she insisted. For all of you. Forever. This is your place now. Colonel Briggs nodded his thanks. He raised his voice to address the entire coffee shop. For those of you who don't know, today you witnessed something important. You saw what happens when good people stand up. You saw what military brotherhood really means. We take care of our own. Always. And if you ever see someone disrespecting a service member, a veteran, or anyone wearing their nation's insignia, you speak up. You call us. You make sure they know that this country stands behind those who stood for us. The customers broke into applause again. Several people were crying. The moment was powerful and raw and real. As the Delta Force operators settled into their seats, ordering coffee and food, the atmosphere became almost festive. They swapped stories. They laughed. They existed in that sacred space that only warriors truly understand, the bond forged through shared danger, shared sacrifice, shared purpose. Sarah sat at the center of it all, her wheelchair no longer a mark of disability but a throne befitting a warrior queen. The Delta Force insignia on her chair wasn't just a symbol anymore. It was a banner. A declaration. A promise that said, "This is who I am. This is what I've done. This is the family that will always have my back." The young barista, her confidence returning now that she was safe, brought Sarah a fresh latte. "This one's perfect," she promised. "I made it myself." Sarah took a sip and smiled. "It's delicious." "Thank you." The barista hesitated, then spoke. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "How do you do it? How do you stay so calm when people are awful to you?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "Because I know who I am," she said finally. "I know what I've done. I know what I'm capable of. The opinions of small-minded people don't change that truth. Words can't hurt me. Mockery can't diminish me. I've faced enemy fire. I've stared down death. Why would I fear the judgment of someone who's never had to be brave?" The barista nodded, absorbing the wisdom. "Thank you. That helps." As the afternoon wore on, the coffee shop became a gathering place. More veterans, drawn by the sight of the government SUVs outside, stopped by. They shared stories. They checked in on each other. They created the kind of community that civilians often read about but rarely witness. And at the center of it all sat Sarah Chen, a woman who had given everything for her country and had found that her country, or at least the parts of it that mattered, gave everything back. The Delta Force insignia on her wheelchair caught the afternoon light, gleaming like a medal of honor. Because that's exactly what it was. If you believe that military service members deserve our respect and protection, type "Leave N01 behind" in the comments. If you believe that true strength comes from sacrifice, not from intimidation, hit that like button. And if you believe these stories need to be told, subscribe to our channel so we can continue sharing the truth about America's heroes. Remember, respect isn't demanded. It's earned. And it's owed to those who've paid the price for our freedom.